It's a great honor to have the opportunity to share words of Torah on the 17th of Tammuz, a day when so much pain and destruction affected the Jewish people. The Mishnah outlines 5 calamities that befell our nation on this day. And amongst them is, BeTamuz, the Rasha, burnt a Sefer Torah. And each year when I remind myself of that catastrophe, I recall a conversation I had with a Jew who'd survived Kristallnacht in Berlin. The world that we today live in is a world where Jews in Berlin once again are trying to embrace Jewish learning and build communities. And a number of years ago, I was asked by that community to help find some educators, some teachers to enhance their learning programs. And a family connection that we have with family Jalowski reminded me that Mr. Jalowski himself and his family had lived in Berlin. And when I next met him, I told him about this extraordinary event that there was Jews in Berlin who were wanting to start learning Torah all again. And I saw his face drop, and he reminded me of his last experiences in Berlin. Kristallnacht, I saw the Germans coming towards our flats. We had a unique relationship with the doorman. And for some reason, he told the Germans where all the Jews lived, but Jalowski, the doctor, leave him alone. And our family was saved. But you want to know my last remembrances, my last impressions of Berlin? I looked out the window of our apartment and I saw as the Germans came into the homes of my neighbors, they didn't only hit and attack the neighbors themselves, but they went into their bookshelves, their Sforim Shank, and they started taking out the books and they threw them one by one from the windows into an enormous heap in the courtyard in front of the flats. And I watched in horror as they burnt, as they set fire to our Sforim. The last thing that I saw the Germans doing on Kristallnacht, and my brother, myself, my sister were able to escape, but the last things that we saw the Germans doing was that they were burning Sforim on that night of Kristallnacht. Friends, as I'm speaking today, I was talking to him about Jews once again learning Sforim, not burning Sforim. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we take the 17th of Tammuz from a sad and painful day of burning into a beautiful, majestic day of learning?
Animals took out the hatred of the Jews, not only of people, but on our books as well. What an extraordinary turnabout. As I'm talking about finding people in Berlin for Torah to be learned, Berlin was Torah being burnt. And each year when we return to this period of time in Jewish history, we ask ourselves the question, what can we do? How can we change these 3 weeks from ones of pain and suffering and mourning to ones of learning, of delight? How can Tisha B'Av once again become a Yontif? Chazal tell us, B'schus Noshim Sidkonias, and I hope there are lots of them listening online. And please bring the message back home. B'schus Noshim Sidkonias, in the merit of the righteous Jewish women, the Jewish people were redeemed from their slavery. There's a pasuk in Koheles. David HaMelech says, Tov Shemen Tov, Tov Shem Shemen Tov. A good name is better than good oil. And everybody knows the beginning of the pasuk. What a blessing to go through life and have a good name. But the end of the pasuk carries on and says, V'yom HaMoves, but the day of death is better than the day of birth. Strange line. The day of death is better than the day of life. Chazal say, what do you mean? It's so strange. When a person's born, there's such excitement, there's such happiness, there's such joy. On the day of death, there's pain, this mourning, the tsar. How can Shlomo Melech say that the day of death is better than the day of being born? Rashi brings down that this is referring, amongst others, to Miriam. Miriam is described as an individual whose day of death was better than her day of birth. What's the message inherent in that? Chazal point out the very name Miriam means ma. It means bitter. Why was she given that name Ma? Because she lived in the most bitter times. Time of extraordinary, barbaric slavery imposed upon us, where families were separated, where people were giving up hope for the future, where the Jews were turned into animals and numbers as they were enslaved by the Egyptians. Ma was describing the reality of the circumstances that Miriam was born into. Yet, if you have a look in Divrei HaYomim, you'll see there in Divrei HaYomim, Aleph, chapter 2, Pasuk Yud Tes, there she's described with a different name. Miriam married Kolev, and one of the names which is given to Miriam is Ephrat, Ephras. Now, Ephrat means to multiply. Ephrat means to increase. In fact, the number of organizations involved in saving Jewish lives, ensuring Jewish lives, which are called Ephrat, because it describes future, a bigger and better tomorrow, multiple. And Miriam's name at the end of her life, or the end of Divrei HaYomim, is described as Ephrat, multiplication. How does that change take place? How do you move from a golus to geula? How do you move from a bitterness to a sense of extraordinary expansion? One of my teachers used to put it this way, that Miriam refused to be defined by her name, and Miriam refused to be defined by her circumstances, her life situation. You can be a prisoner of your upbringing. You can be a prisoner of your past, or you can say, I'm going to build a better tomorrow. And I'm not going to allow that past to define who I am. I often think about that because in the last few months I lost my dear father, Shalom. And he was born in Germany, and he was born in 1928. And on his 70th birthday, I heard for the first time in my life how my uncle described how as 4, 5, 6-year-olds, their classmates who had been their friends in Germany turned on them, and they became the evil Jew. And then how in the late 1930s they managed to come to England. Now, coming to England with the name Hunts on the eve of the Second World War is not a good name to carry around with you. But he refused to be defined by that past, by that upbringing. So many people are burdened by the past and they can't move on. The first word said to Avraham Avinu is, Lech lecha mi'atzecha, move. There have, of course, been some great things you've been inspired by in your past. But if you really want to change the world, you have to learn not to be imprisoned by that past. And when my father, Oliver Shalom, passed away, he was named as Shlomo, not Hans. That's not how we knew him. Chazal tell us that in the schus of Moshe, Aaron and Miriam, Klal Yisrael had different gifts in the midbar, extraordinary gifts. One, Moshe, the Ananei HaKovod, Aaron, Vayova b'nei Yisrael kol ha'eda midbar sin, and the community arrived in midbar sin, b'chodesh harishon, vayeshev ha'am b'kodesh, v'tameh shomeriah, and there they were living in a place called Kodesh, and Miriam Hanaviyah died, and she was buried there. And the very next pasuk, famously, we know, it tells us, V'lo hoya mayim le'edo, they didn't have any water. Says the Gemara, in the schus in Tammuz, Tes, Amud Aleph, in the schus of Miriam Hanaviyah, Klal Yisrael had water. And of course, we have to ask the question, what's the connection between each one of these greats and the nisim which happened in their merit? But let's focus, if we can, for the meanwhile, on Miriam. In the schus of Miriam, Klal Yisrael had water. In what schus? Which schus? So I'll share with you, if I can, 3 or 4 different insights, each of which will share with us a fascinating understanding of who Miriam was, what she was, the lessons from her, and why b'schus noshin sidkonius and anoshin tzadikim we can change our circumstances and our situations. Chazal described to us v'tirena hamilodos es Elokim, that Miriam and Yocheved, alias Shifra and Pura, or Shifra and Pura, alias Miriam and Yocheved, were midwives. And though Pharaoh had made an edict to destroy every new baby boy who was born, they feared HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'lo oso kasher dibar aleim melech Mitzrayim, v'techayenu es hayolodim, and they allowed the children to live. They allowed the children to live. Says Rashi, they fed them and they gave them water. Miriam, Yocheved, Shifra, Pua, they gave them that which would sustain them, the basics. Not only did they risk their lives to bring them into the world, but they risked their lives to ensure that that world would be a long living world for these children. To sustain their lives and care for them, Rashi says they bring them water. And perhaps in the merit of the water and the sustenance which was given to these children at birth, a multiple takes place. And Klal Yisrael will give them water in the midbar for 40 years. But it's interesting here, because we notice another name which is given to Miriam. Miriam, Ephrat, but she's also called Pua. And Chazal point out the name Pua means to restore, to bring back. When all is lost and people can't believe in a better future, she restores the belief. She brings it back to people. And perhaps in the merit of looking after all these beautiful little bibbelas, we have the merit of Klal Yisrael being saved and given water in the midbar. Chazal point out a deeper idea, and they say as follows. What was Miriam doing? She was believing and she was ensuring the future, because she was delivering babies into the world. She was delivering new life into the world. There's even an organization called Pua which attempts to do likewise. I think they've got a charity campaign coming up soon, which is nothing unusual. Bringing life into the world, nurturing life, caring for life, and believing in life for the future. And when people describe what it's like to be in the horrors of a concentration camp, of a Stalinist labor camp, in the middle of pogrom, you're talking about tomorrow? It's hard enough for me to think about today. But wasn't that what Miriam said to her parents when they separated and didn't want to have any future life? You're worse than Paro. He only wants to kill the boys. You're stopping girls coming to life. And of course, the very child who was born there becomes the Moshiach of Klal Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Which brings us on to a second fascinating insight as to what Klal Yisrael, why they merited the water in Miriam's suchos. The Zohar Kodesh says that Levi, and they have this baby, and the baby, of course, grows up, and we have to hide it. So what happens? They hide the baby. And what does Miriam do? Miriam stands at a distance to watch, to see. The very baby she'd helped come into life, she stands at a distance. Where? By the River Nile, to watch and see what will happen to this baby. But Tiftach and Teres are yellow, they open up, and there's the baby, V'yina Becha. And Basya, the Egyptian princess, sees the child, and she says, let's take it. Couldn't find anybody to feed him, and as we know the story, Miriam was there to look after the baby. And the Zohar Kodesh says, by the water, Miriam watched and waited. What's going to happen to the Moshiach of Klal Yisrael? She was there to save them by the water, and the merit Klal Yisrael get water. I once saw of Noah Weinberg asked the following question. But what about Bisya? What about Basya? She was the one who risked her life as well. She was by the water, she cared for him, and she took him into the palace in a world which he was the very person their father wanted to kill. Yet she was willing to risk her life in order to bring up Moshe. Are you telling me the merit of Miriam, who also was there? Of course. But what about this righteous woman? How many lives were saved by righteous non-Jews in the Siddim Avenue of the Righteous in the Yad Vashem? It's not vast amounts. They're great acts of heroism, and they should be treated as such and responded to. Why is it that Miriam is the one, according to the Zohar, that in her merit we got water? What about Basya? This is a fascinating insight. Basya saw this baby crying, and she had Rachmanis. A heroic act, she saved his life. But Miriam's approach was to saving the whole of Klal Yisrael, to saving the Mashiach of Klal Yisrael, and saving baby after baby after baby. This was not one heroic act on Miriam's case. This was her desire to change the destiny of the Jewish people, to ensure there was a future for the Jewish people, to ensure that the promises which were given to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were real and they would take place, and Klal Yisrael would one day have the schus of going into Eretz Yisrael. And interesting enough, there are further reasons as well. Perhaps one of the most famous encounters with water that takes place with Miriam is Vatechach Miriam Hanavia Achas Aaron Es Hataf Bioda. Famous moment when Klal Yisrael cross over to the other side of the sea and miraculously are saved against all odds. And Ozu Shemoshe B'nei Yisrael Es Asher Zeh Keli Vanveir. The tefillah, which is so central and so sanctified that every day in our davening we mention it. And unfortunately, point out there are a number of subtle differences in the song that Miriam sang after Moshe Rabbeinu sang. First of all, according to Zalman Sorotskin, she sang exactly the same shira as Moshe Rabbeinu, but she sang it in a different sort of way. And the pasuk tells us, first of all, she came and she took the taf biyoda. She took the music, and all the women followed on after her. That means she started and she inspired all the women around her, and the women around her followed on from her extraordinary example. And not only that, they did it with tufim b'cholos. They did it with musical instruments and dances, which is not used to describe the men. So she inspired the women to follow her. It wasn't Ozu Shem Moshe B'nei Yisrael. Please everybody join in. No. Miriam did it, and everybody followed as a result of her heroic example. And she had musical instruments, and she got everybody dancing. The way the Mefarshim explain it is, she added a vivacity, she added an energy, she added a degree of absolute conviction into her singing of the Ozu Shem Moshe. That's how the Mefarshim explain it, and I understand it. And she was able, through her personal example, to inspire other people to follow as well. She was able, through her personal example, to get the other women. And then the vessel in that energy spilled over into a dance. With every essence of my being, I'm thinking, I'm thanking, I'm singing to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's very interesting because when the B'Yisrael Salanta saw the very first steam engine, the Bali Musa like to take Musa from everything that they say in life. When he saw the very first steam engine, he was watching with amazement how the steam engine at the top was able to pull with it 20 carriages behind it. And he turned to one of his Talmidim and says, amazing limit we get. If a person has energy, if a person has fire, if they're alive, they can pull hundreds with them. That's what a steam engine is teaching me. There are 20 carriages which are being drawn. And Miriam was an inspiration to saving lives, to building lives, and inspiring other people to fight for and build for and live for and believe in a better tomorrow. And of course, perhaps the most famous example, though not directly connected to water, although she used it to play at the water, is that the women had musical instruments. And where did they get musical instruments from in the desert? There was no, do you remember Boozy and Hawks in the old days when you were the old? There was no place to get musical instruments. As I explained, no. In the midst of the deprivation and the slavery in Egypt, Miriam said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said it's going to be a better tomorrow. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says we're going from Golas to Gula. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says we're going to Eretz HaKodesh and we're going to be there with the Binyan Beis Hamikdash. And if HaKadosh Baruch Hu says so, then we are right now in this impossible servitude. When we get out, we're going to want to celebrate, dance and sing to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So let's start making the musical instruments now, so we'll be able to celebrate later. And I'm sure many people said, what are you doing? She says, I'm making musical instruments because I'm going to celebrate. We're worried about eating. We're worried about living. We're about the continuation of it. I believe that's tomorrow is going to be a better day, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is maftiach us, he promised us, and therefore my life now is about inspiring other people to do it and doing likewise. And she had musical instruments when she came out. She danced, and they followed her dance. She danced with energy, and they followed her energy. And she had musical instruments because in a real, tangible way, she lived a life which meant that tomorrow can be a bigger and better day. Say Chazal, the day of death is better than the day of life. Because when a person comes into this world, we have potential. The day of death is the moment when a person can look back at their life and have fulfilled their potential. Miriam Hamaviah was able to look back at that extraordinary life of hers and see at Klal Yisrael literally on the borders of Eretz Yisrael. From the servitude and the suffering and the pain of distraction to the building of an opportunity which soon Yeshua is going to take them into Eretz Yisrael. Chazal point out that there's another individual who's mentioned in reference to this extraordinary lesson. Tov Shem Mishem and Tov. There's another individual who we have to understand helped take us on the journey and will take us on a journey from the bitterness of exile to the blessing of a Binyan Beis Hamikdash. And that's none other than the Kohen Gadol himself, Aaron HaKohen. Rashi brings down the Yom HaMoves is better than the day of death, is also referring to Aaron HaKohen. The potential of Aaron HaKohen when he was born. But when he died, look what he has, look what he became. And everybody in Klal Yisrael wept when Aaron HaKohen died, having fulfilled such extraordinary potential. Now, I'm always marveled when I remind myself in Tisha B'Av, and we sit on the floor and cry, which Mitzvah Hashem this year we're not going to do. We sit on the floor and cry. We say we cry.
Which we're not going to do. Why are we not going to do it?
They spoke Rosh Hashanah about Eretz Yisrael. And as a result of that, they cried tears for no reason, and sadly we continue to cry tears because of their tears they shed for no reason. Correspond that to the tears that every man, woman, and child cried nearly 40 years later when Aaron HaKohen died. And why were we crying when Aaron HaKohen died? Because he was an Oyev Shalom, a Roidev Shalom, a love of peace and a pursuit of peace. What are the limudim we can learn from the life of Aaron HaKohen as we are on the Shiva Assar BeTamuz preparing for Tisha B'Av? Well, we sing a song on Yom Kippur about Mare Kohen, what it was to see the Kohen Gadol come out. When we see and read the Kiddush of Tisha B'Av, and we see the difference between the pain of destruction and what Yerushalayim was. When we read the poems written there by Yehuda Halevi about the beauty, the majesty, what Eretz Yisrael was in its complete Kedusha, what Beis Hamikdash was. And we realize that the centrality of that Beis Hamikdash was the life of the Kohen, the priest, the teacher of Klal Yisrael. Aaron HaKohen was an Oyev Shalom v'Rodev Shalom. Says the Gemara in Sanhedrin, what did Aaron do in his life to garner such extraordinary support from people that he was that individual? Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us that he was a judge. Moshe Rabbeinu was a judge. Klal Yisrael led many judges. And when cases would come to Moshe Rabbeinu, he would paskin, muta, osa, chayev, potter. What would happen with Aaron HaKohen? Aaron HaKohen would be aware that in 2 or 3 days there's going to be a court case coming to me, and he would do whatever he could to go to the litigants, to go to the claimants, to go to those who are arguing, and try and sort everything out before they ever came to court in the first place. That's what the Gemara says. Have a look at it. Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Vav on the base. And the Gemara explains how he would sort of literally go up to one person and try and be melamed zchus, try and get I understand it's difficult. I know what's going. In other words, it's not just an oyev shalom as, just checking on you and seeing everything's all right. On a real practical basis, he attempted to make shalom between people. And regardless of who and what and how and when and why, he attempted to make sure that the court case never comes to peace. I remember once hearing, between Pesach and Shavuos, Pesach, Rosh Hashanah, we learn Pirkei Avos. And I think the disciple asked the question, why is Pirkei Avos in the middle of Nezikin? Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Makkah, Sanhedrin, and then we've got these sayings by these great Rabbonim talking about how to have Midas Tovos, what the most important lessons that I've learned in life, what I should stay away from, I shouldn't stay to be like Avram Avinu, be careful not to be like Bilam, v'chula, v'chula. Why is that in Nezikin? Of all the Shishay Sidra Mishnah, why is it in that Seder? As I said, I think this was the disciple. He said like this, because so much of Nezikin is telling you what to do when things go wrong, how to correct them, how to deal with the problems when they go wrong. Perhaps if people learn Pirkei Avos more, not so many things would go wrong, which you'd need the rest of Nezikin to help fix. He used to say that a person doesn't learn Pirkei Avos, it's much like a dog vicious Rabbi. He's like a wild person in the public thoroughfare. Because Pirkei Avos is living Torah life and trying as best as one can to ensure that the problems are dealt with before they ever get to court. Obviously, this is sometimes a dream situation, but the point is we try our hardest to make shalom, and we see that Aaron HaKohen made shalom. Moshe Rabbeinu would tell people off. After all, the Torah says, you do something wrong, you get told off. Aaron HaKohen would become the bad guy's best friend. It's Chazal tell us, it's Medrash. Aaron HaKohen would go out of his way. When he saw there was a troublemaker, there was a problematic person, he would befriend the guy who's causing the difficulty, the guy who's causing the problem. And of course, after a while, the person who's causing the problem feels a bit uncomfortable that the Kohen Gadol is hanging around with him. This love of peace and this pursuit of peace is going out of his way to become my friend. And the amazing thing about people are that if you show your love and your care, if you believe in those people, maybe they can change. I remember hearing once from Rabbi Beryl Wine about Avram Avinu, that Avram Avinu saw these lowlifes, these idolaters, these despicable individuals. He said, but he treated them like human beings. And they turn out to be angels. What an incredible insight. If we can treat people like human beings, maybe we can help them find the angelic. And all of us, and I'm top of the list, fell miserably in our interactions with the people around us. And the sin of Sinas Chinam, which destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash, is so much part of our lives today. But Oyev Shalom, V'rodei Shalom is not just somebody who loved it, but they pursued it with their very life, with their energy and their beliefs as well. And of course, between husbands and wife, we no longer have a Beis Hamikdash, but we do have a Bais Ne'eman, the Yudeshes, with the language which is used between the husband and wife. And the sanctity of your home was so important to Aaron HaKohen, the high priest who would enter into the Kodesh Kadosh in Yom Kippur, nobody else could. But the sanctity of the home was so central to him that he believed there's an Oyev Shalom V'rodei for Shalom V'oyev says Abrios Mekam L'Torah, that I've got to bring people together. I've got to bring husband and wife together. I've got to bring families together. I've got to bring communities together. I've got to go out of my way to ensure that there's love, that there's beauty. We ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Hashivenu. We ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, V'fos Oleim Sukkos Shaleimecha. We ask once again, Harachamon, V'yokim Lona Sukkos Dovid Anafolis. We want the Sukkos. We want that there's protection. In whose zechus did Klal Yisrael have protection in the Midbar? In the zechus of Aaron HaKohen. In his merit, the Jewish people had the Ananei covered. They had security. Security from the enemies from without, and security from even nature. Air conditioning was available for them. Comfort was there. It could be hot, cold outside, could be raining, could be sunny. HaKadosh Baruch Hu protected them with the Aron Yaakov. And one extraordinary message. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu protects you from the outside enemies when we work to protect ourselves by doing our utmost. People say Kirsch are being a little naive, but one at a time, one machlokes at a time, one disagreement at a time, we'll get involved in these things and we'll try our best to stop them. And all of us are as guilty as each other. All of us have caused so much rubbish and problems in the past. But we're desperate to follow the example of Aaron HaKohen and bring Sukkos Shalom Mecha, the Adonai HaKavod, back to Klal Yisrael, which we so desperately need. One of my teachers used to say, that's true in terms of the outside enemies, but there's another enemy. That the Adonai HaKavod protected us from the elements as well, the natural elements. And we have, all of us have natural elements inside of us. Our gaiva, our taiva, our egos, our lusts, our lack of self-esteem, you name it, which are probably the reasons for the problems that we find ourselves in our interactions with people as well. The Vilna Gaon always says that there's always two teshuvas a person does when they've done a chet. He says so on Yom Kippur. There's the tshuva for the chet itself, and then there's the tshuva for the midara, the bad character trait, the gaiva, the taiva, that caused the problem in the first place. And Aaron HaKohen protected us from the elements because he taught us how to protect ourselves from our own elements as well, our own natural elements. And as source of that, Klal Yisrael had the Adonai HaKavod, had that protection in the wilderness. So Shem Mishem and Tov, not being defined by the circumstances and situations that you find yourselves in. The machlokes has been going on for generations. And the halacha is, it's forbidden to continue it. I haven't spoken to my neighbor in years. And the halacha is, I've got to do everything I possibly can to build it. Yeah, but Rabbi Kirsch, we're coming to another Tisha B'Av, we're coming to another 3 weeks. I've heard all these drushes before, and it hasn't changed, but I know that I can change. I know that I can change, and I know and I believe I can inspire other people to change as well. And just like Miriam, our Neviah, believed in a better tomorrow, and she acted in such a way, it behooves all of us to bring back that water to Klal Yisrael, to nourish Klal Yisrael, and believe in the children of the future by investing in the present. And it behooves each one of us at this time of year, as it does throughout the year, to love peace and pursue peace and draw as many people close to Torah. And let people know we love them. Let people know we care about them. Let people know we're willing to be mavata and hold back on our own desires. Mitzvah Hashem. And the source of that extraordinary generation, which saw such amazing changes take place in their own lives, we should likewise go from bitterness to redemption. I look forward to seeing you in Yerushalayim rebuilt. In here of Yomeinu. Amen. Thank you very much.